suddenly my agent calls me and says, I've got a rather interesting proposal. The Fleming estate would like to commission the first authorized biography of Ian Fleming since John Pearson's excellent biography in 1966. And we have new material, much has come out, and would you be interested? And I confess my first reaction, apart from inhaling a tiny bit of the flattery, was very great wariness, because I don't know about you lot, but I mean, my impression of Fleming was I'd only seen him out of sideways glimpses as a kind of Daily Mail caricature. And I suppose one of the morals of the story is don't run off with the wife of the owner of the Daily Mail if you don't wish forever after to be turned into tabloid fat, which seems to have been his fate. So the image I had from sideways glimpses was of a kind of old Etonian cad who would hit the road after beating his wife and go off to the golf club and his bridge club, and he'd come home late at night smoking Turkish cigarettes, having eaten scrambled egg and having had a few martinis, and he'd go back to his house where his very intellectual wife, Anne Fleming, would be entertaining people like Evelyn Waugh and Cyril Connolly and Isaiah Berlin, all these intellectuals, and this drawing was on the first floor, and they would suddenly see Fleming standing there. And on one occasion, apparently, he heard the laughter as Cyril Connolly was reading out one of the sex scenes from Casino Royale to great titters. Anyway, there's this scene where he stands there, they all suddenly realize he's watching them. And he goes on up to bed in this monastic top floor bedroom where he unzips his jacket and he takes off his bow tie and he goes to sleep with a blanket over his head to drown out the sniggers. I mean, that was my image of Ian Fleming. And I thought, do I want to spend 4 years in the company of such a cad and a bounder? So my second reaction was say, well, this sounds really interesting, and could I have a couple of months of due diligence while I kind of dig in to see whether I want to do this? And I think my inclination was going to be to say no. And so two things happened in the next 2 months. I found that he was a much kinder person than I'd hitherto anticipated. And again, the women with whom he'd had affairs, and as Rebecca West said, there were enough to fill the Albert Hall, poor dear, and they'd all fallen in love with him, and he kept making, or not making, but having women falling in love with him and keeping in love with him after their affairs were over. So he wasn't a kind of Harvey Weinstein figure. And so again and again I would come across somebody like Maud Russell, who he'd had an affair with during the Second World War and who paid for Goldeneye. I found her unpublished diaries in which 7 years after Fleming dies, she says, I think of Ian, I think of his character, and above all, his kindliness. Now, kindliness is a great prize quality for a biographer to discover, especially when you think he's a kind of bounder. And so it was also men who felt he was very kind. The men were slightly less interesting than the women. They tended to be old Etonian friends of his who played golf and bridge, but were all very upstanding, like his grandfather, who had been born in a slum in Dundee, but then became the richest man in Europe, having founded Fleming's Bank on the back of the kind of railroad expansion in America. He had a brilliant ruse. He only needed one ruse, which was to invest all the jute money in Dundee, and he found out that the American railroads were giving you 7% interest rather than 3% in England. So he just took it over to America to finance the railroads, which was like the kind of tech boom today. And by the time he's 30, he is a multimillionaire, and he owns the site on Grosvenor Square, which becomes the American embassy and where the Kennedys are just before the war. So his grandfather was this very stern, pious Scotsman, and most of Fleming's male friends were very upstanding like him. He'd made most of these friendships at Eton, and they continued to the rest of his life, and they were all very, very loyal to Fleming, and they all thought of him as a kind, good person. Now, that was also an interesting thing to discover, because a lot of kind of womanizers don't get on with the male sex too. So a bit like Bruce Chatwin, he attracted both sexes. There's no evidence that he had affairs with men. I think he was entirely heterosexual in that respect. So he's kind, that's the first thing. Interesting. The second thing is that he was a lot more important than the Daily Mail caricature. My old boss at the Telegraph, Max Hastings, who I greatly admire, can't be shifted from his opinion that Fleming was just a chocolate sailor who, during the war, where he was the commander, number 2 to the head of naval intelligence, Admiral Godfrey, that Fleming, he just had his feet up in room 39 and was in charge of in-trays, out-trays, and ashtrays. And I think that is also an image that I imbibed, that he was an unimportant man while all his friends were fighting for England and risking their lives and often giving their lives. And he was just in his rather smart commander's uniform, ordering his Moreland cigarettes from the Burlington Arcade and going around in a Lagonda. Then, so what I unpick, this becomes a bit more difficult because so much of the intelligence material is either destroyed or it's in the wrong boxes. So I could have spent 20 years at the National Archives looking for what has already been gone through very, very methodically by many, many scholars. And that's not where you're going to find the material. It's going to be in unmarked boxes where, after the war, it was all disseminated. So I knew I couldn't spend too much time there. I did discover that most of the areas, like the SOE and CIA, many of these archives had been destroyed as soon as the war is over. In the Admiralty, they're kind of burning all the naval intelligence archives. So I kind of didn't feel I was going to find so much, but enough emerged to show that so far from being a chocolate sailor, he was, in the words of Admiral Godfrey, his boss, the head of naval intelligence, he said, Ian was a war winner. And I think one has to kind of remember that during the war, you may only have been a commander, but you had, as an individual, so much more responsibility. So during the war, an individual could make, the difference that Zelensky is making in Ukraine now, or that Churchill made. Fleming made a similar difference in intelligence. And naval intelligence was the first kind of the three arms of intelligence, the one to be engaged immediately. Army and Air Force intelligence weren't really in operation until the phony war ends 8 months later. So naval intelligence is in operation from the word go, September the 3rd, when Churchill comes back to the Admiralty as First Lord, a position he'd left in disgrace after 25 years before, after the Dardanelles. So what I discover is that Fleming has this kind of amazing, he's given the complete freedom by his boss to go into all these areas of intelligence. He's got his fingers in every intelligence pie. So he's setting up something like the topographic unit, which he sets up in Oxford, which is he gets the BBC to advertise all people's holiday snaps so that they can build papier-mâché models of the beaches and the cliff tops where D-Day will happen and where they will land in Sicily or North Africa. So they have 50 girls in Oxford, sifting through these photographs and building papier-mâché models of the kind of the designated landing areas. He's also setting up propaganda unit with Sefton Delmer. And one of the things I discovered is that Fleming, he hadn't gone to university, but he went to Central Europe in Kitzbühel and became a kind of Central European intellectual after he left Eton and after he left Sandhurst. He got the clap in Sandhurst, so that was that curtailed his army career. So he goes off to Austria and is kind of trained to join the Foreign Office, which he doesn't get into, but during this period, he's 20, 21, he's learning Russian, he's learning French, he's learning German, and at age 20, he's one of those who are considered to translate All Quiet on the Western Front into English. So, and he translates Klaus Mann, he translates Carl Jung, Paracelsus' paper. This is all his 2021. Now, that's not the image I had of Fleming. The only 3 books in the Bond series, I think Bond reads How to Improve Your Golf, and there's another book he doesn't read, but he holds, which I think is JFK's Profiles in Courage. But Bond is not a reader or an intellectual, and I think I'd assume that nor was Fleming. So that was, and Fleming also, while he's in his 20s, before the war, starts collecting books and first editions of science. He calls it where history happens at a right angle, where suddenly there's a manual on the first rules of golf, or where the first history of how to make a tarmac road. He buys all these books, and they are one of the most important collections in private hands, and they're now in the Lilly Library in Bloomington, Indiana. So he was a kind of dilettante intellectual, autodidact, and he's using his German fluency to do broadcasts in the war to German submarines to tell them that if they go in the English Channel, the English have imported white sharks from Australia, so if they fall into the sea, they'll be eaten. All this kind of black propaganda that he loved. He loved all these kind of jokes, and he was fluently talking in German on these BBC broadcasts. He's also setting up an intelligence gathering unit called 30AU, which it grew to about 400 people by the end of the war. But this was to go in with the forward troops and to try and get all the code books, the Enigma machines, which they couldn't tell their troops what they were looking for. They called them typewriters. No one knew about Enigma, and one of the extraordinary things about Fleming is that he and his brother Peter were two of only 30 people who were cleared to see all the ultra material. In April 1940, there are 30 people in England. Churchill's Supremos aren't allowed to see it, but Fleming and his brother are, and they're allowed to see where the material comes from. They go to Bletchley every 2 weeks. This is an extraordinary inner sanctum access. And, two other writers I knew, I didn't know Fleming, but I knew Graham Greene and John le Carré, and both of whom are better writers than Fleming, but both of them slightly give the impression that they were in the epicenter of intelligence, whereas Graham Greene was kind of counting condoms in French West Africa. He had no important role there. And he was trying to set up a brothel in Dakar, I think, which he would hope would overhear, the Vichy French officers reveal secrets. And Le Carré, he had no successful operation to his name, I don't think, as a junior intelligence officer in Hamburg. Fleming is in the inner sanctum. He is ultra cleared. He is setting up these intelligence units that will get Enigma machines from Sicily and from North Africa, and these, many historians believe, helped shorten the war by 18 months. He's also involved, one of only 2 or 3 people in the room, sometimes he's also in the bedroom, but in this case he's in the room, setting up what is America's first foreign intelligence service. Now, it's incredible to think that in 1940-41, America had no foreign intelligence service. Their service was 12 people to protect the president, I think. So Churchill's mother's American. Churchill realizes the only way we can get to win the war is to bring America in. America is neutral at that time, although Roosevelt is very kind of pro-ally behind the scenes, but he can't be seen to be too demonstrably pro-ally or he'd be impeached. So Fleming is one of the handful of officers who try and get America into the war by encouraging Roosevelt to set up an intelligence service based on the English model, which can then, as soon as America does come into the war, which he will do after Pearl Harbor, can then kind of marry together and work with the British. So Fleming goes out with his boss, Admiral Godfrey, in May 1941 to America, and everything's collapsing in Europe. I mean, we are about to go under, and this is a matter of urgency. And they get to meet Roosevelt, and they beg him to set up this man, Colonel William Donovan, who is very pro-British, to be in charge of this. It was called the COI to begin with, and then it became the OSS, and in 1947 it becomes the CIA. And Fleming sits with Colonel Donovan in Georgetown, Washington, during May and June and July, working with him on a blueprint for what an intelligence service is going to be and what the personnel would be, many of whom Fleming suggests in those early days. And so by the time the CIA happens, Fleming knows people like Alan Dulles, who's the head of the CIA. He knows most of the kind of the big swinging dicks in the CIA, because he's not only been involved in their recruitment in 1941 and 42, but they're kind of swimming in the same sea. I mean, so all of this is suggesting that Fleming is not a chocolate sailor. In addition, as the war comes to an end, he is chairing JIC, Joint Intelligence Committee meetings, particularly against the new V2 bombs. I mean, this is an extraordinarily important function in the British intelligence network. And he's chairing Joint Intelligence Bureau meetings in 1945 about the future of an intelligence service. And he is asked to contribute to the Bland Report in April 1945, which is looking at what the future of British intelligence will be after the war. And Fleming, did find one document that hadn't been seen, and I knew this because he signs things IF, and so and with his pencil, so I knew this was him. And he's predicting drones, he's predicting cyber warfare, he's predicting the arenas of conflict. He doesn't predict that China will have a navy, but I mean, he is predicting Suez and Venezuela and places that are, you wouldn't necessarily have thought of in 1945. So he did have a kind of very forward-looking mind in that respect. And it's clear that in 1945, he is offered a job in this, what will be the post-war intelligence system. And I suspect he would have become, had he taken that job, which he was debating whether to do, he would have become, probably in the 50s, the head of the British Intelligence Service, as indeed his brother Peter, his elder brother, in 1952, when they were looking for a new head. Peter was one of the 5 candidates who they considered. By this time, Fleming was out of, or officially out of, the intelligence service. So I often came to think afterwards that all the Bond books are about Fleming being terrified of getting married. He's about to get married, and he's 2 months away from getting married. His girlfriend is pregnant, and so he sits down at a typewriter in Jamaica to write the book he's always wanted to write. And in a sense, he's going back into his bachelor life, and he's doing all the operations that he planned in the Second World War, but he's putting them into a Cold War setting, and he's also exploring his own, what he would have done had he stayed in the service in 1945, exploring a kind of fantasy life of what the kind of jobs he would have done against the Russians this time. I think one of the things about the sex in the Bond books is that we all think it's very kind of looking forward to the 60s, and it's so kind of modern. In fact, he's just reheating the cabbage of all the Blitz sex that they got up to. I mean, the Blitz was an extraordinary sexual, humid arena. I remember Victoria Glendinning, a wonderful biographer, telling me that she had a very, very cold mother, Lady Seabohm, who she didn't get on with. And right at the end of her life, the mother looked up and said, "Darling, I had a great time in the Blitz," and talked about how she'd crossed Berkeley Square one night and caught the eyes of an American officer, and without a word, they just went up into the Lansdowne Club and spent the night there. And Victoria, I guess, had never been revealed that her mother was such a character. But I think that happened to a lot of people in the Second World War. You didn't know if you were going to see this person again, and so you wanted to leave on good terms, and good terms often meant going to bed with them. And so I think Bond, sorry, I'm going off a tangent, but I mean, I think all Bond sexuality is just reheated Cold War stuff, Blitz stuff in a Cold War dressing. So going back to, I've got away from my, so he's more important than so he's kinder than I expected, and he's more important than I expected. And so there was a third element. Writers are the two guiding stars for writers are skepticism and superstition. And if you're going to spend 4 or 5 years, especially for a biographer, in the company of somebody, you really do need 1 or 2 twinkles in the sky that you're on the right path. And this indeed happened in my case, because when I was thinking about this, my father said, "Oh, I knew John Pearson," who was the first biographer, 1966 biography. He'd shared a desk with John Pearson in 1953 at the Times Education Supplement. John Pearson had then joined Ian Fleming on the Sunday Times as his right-hand man on Atticus. And my father went to the Foreign Office and became the private secretary of Gladwin Jebb in Paris, who had founded SOE, the kind of the organization in 1940 that Fleming was often liaising with. And then my father went to the Times and worked for Frank Giles on the Times, who then took over from Fleming on the Sunday Times. And so my father just said, oh God, I knew John Pearson, very nice man. So I got them to meet 66 years later. They had lunch. And it was a fantastic meeting, these two old journos. And John Pearson gave me his Fleming file. And it's this again, a superstitious thing that you don't want to tread in somebody else's area. I mean, I hope if somebody wanted to do a biography of Bruce Chatwin, I would immediately can give them all my papers. But a lot of people don't do that. There are a lot of writers who don't like, and I'm sure academics here will have similar experiences. You don't want to tread on people's toes. So it was wonderful to have Pearson give me his folder of stuff that he'd amassed since his biography came out, and also a blessing for me to continue in that way. So there was so then I discovered that my grandfather, Major William Shakespeare, had been in charge of the hospital in Ypres in 1915, the British Hospital, and he'd called on Fleming's father, Val Fleming, to help him tug out 359 people on stretchers. And they then both inhaled the same cloud of chlorine gas. So in each of their diaries, this cloud is described. And I thought that was a really interesting kind of little tingle. My great uncle, Geoffrey Shakespeare, my grandfather's younger brother, then became Churchill's right-hand man in the first 6 months of the war. When Churchill goes back to the Admiralty as First Lord, he's met by Geoffrey Shakespeare as his parliamentary economic secretary, whatever the function was, and Geoffrey receives Churchill's first order on the first day of the war, which is to get him a bottle of whiskey. And anyway, for the next 6 months, Geoffrey and Churchill are literally above Fleming's desk in room 39. I went and kind of found this out. It is directly above. And so Fleming would have heard my great uncle and Churchill every day and bumped into them in the corridors. Not a very important thing, but a nice kind of little link. Then this happened, I was approached at the same time as my son was at the same house at Eton as the Fleming was. And there's a Fleming room there with all Fleming's kind of posters of the books and the films. The room was set up when Peter Fleming was the most famous old Etonian, his elder brother, and no one would have known about Ian Fleming, who was a kind of black sheep. But now no one's heard of Peter Fleming. It's all Ian Fleming. And my son was able to take me into what was very, very important thing for Fleming. He became a member of POP, this rather strange self-electing body, which I wasn't an Etonian, but they wear waistcoats like this. Well, not as nice as this. But, and so Fleming kind of treated his life thereafter as if he was a member of POP. In every institution, he would kind of act as if he was still a member of the self-elected group that ran the world. And so many of these people in POP did go on to run the world in a sense. But so my son was able to take me into, my son was a member of POP too, so he was able to take me into this really ghastly room with kind of like a French brothel with kind of mauve curtains all drawn and smell of tobacco. And so I was able to see into the sanctum of what would have been Fleming's, he would have held it very high in his pantheon of achievements. And my son also had won the Victor Ludorum, which was Fleming's greatest achievement at Eton. He won the sports thing 2 years in a row. So that was a little, kind of, again, another tingle. Then on my mother's side, there was a tingle. Fleming's, the person who alerted Fleming to Jamaica was a man called Alec Waugh, who was Evelyn Waugh's elder brother. And he had been there in 1929, and he told Fleming all about it. And Alec Waugh also told Fleming the secret of writing. The only secret is to write 2,000 words every morning without fail, not letting anything interrupt you. Now, these were the rules that my grandfather, my mother's father, had given Alec Waugh at Sherborne, where he had taught him and had got his rather scandalous novel, The Loom of Youth, published when Alec Waugh was still in 17, and my grandfather took it up to his publisher, Grant Richard, and got it published, and it then became this kind of great scandal, as a result of which Evelyn Waugh wasn't allowed wasn't allowed to go to Sherman, had to go to Lancing, and so he had this resentment against his elder brother, a bit like Ian Fleming had against his elder brother Peter. So my grandfather had given, it turns out, Alec Waugh the kind of rules for writing which Alec Waugh passes on to Ian Fleming. But my grandfather had also given Alec Waugh an idea when he was 17. My grandfather kept talking about our ancestors who'd gone out to Jamaica and they'd had a family with some of their black workers on the sugar plantation. My grandfather always wanted to go out to Jamaica and see the black maces. He was called SBB Mason. He wanted to see the black maces. And he talked to the 17-year-old Alec Waugh about this. Alec Waugh then, after the war, becomes unable to publish. Suddenly, Evelyn Waugh's the great writer. Brideshead is the great book. Alec Waugh can't even get published, having been this famous writer. And he's thinking of taking his life. And he gets all these barbiturates lined up. His son Peter told me. And he's thinking of taking his life when he bumps into my grandfather again. This is kind of 30 years on, who's just had lunch at the Cumberland Hotel, where he was hoping to see his cousin Roger Mace from Jamaica, who's become a very famous writer and novelist. But my grandfather didn't know he was black, so he was expecting a white Mace in the Cumberland, and a black poet comes in, and they don't recognize each other for a bit. Anyway, when my grandfather realizes it's his cousin, absolutely thrilled. Finally, 30 years on, he meets and they have this fantastic lunch, and he bumps into Alec Waugh after it and says, I've finally met Roger Mace. And Alec Waugh has an idea, and he writes a book, which gets the biggest advance in Hollywood's history at that time, $250,000. It becomes an amazingly successful novel, and it's based slightly on what my grandfather told him about our black cousins. And it becomes a musical with Joan LaFontaine and Harry Belafonte called Islands in the Sun. And in Jamaica, a 17-year-old son of Ian Fleming's last love and mistress, a boy called Chris Blackwell, who Fleming has employed as a gopher on the set of Dr. No, which is about to be made as the first kind of Bond movie. Chris Blackwell wants to start a record company, which he will produce, and he decides to call it Island Records after this film and this novel. Chris Blackwell now owns GoldenEye, where all the 14 Bond books were written. And that's a rather long link, but I mean, this again was tingling for me. None of these things are important. It's about the superstition I was alluding to earlier. So the final thing was my wife, who is Icelandic Canadian, said, "Oh, Ian Fleming." She said, "But you know that the man he based the character of Bond on, he grew up in our family in Winnipeg." And I said, "What the hell are you talking about?" So my wife is Icelandic Canadian, and she explained, it was her father, my father-in-law, who revealed this story in 1980. We're talking about a man called William Stevenson, the quiet Canadian, a man called Intrepid, who was in charge of British intelligence in the Second World War in America. And Churchill sends him out in 1940 to New York to try and get the Americans in on our side. And so he sends this Canadian millionaire who Fleming gets on incredibly well with, and it's him with William Donovan, who are sorting out the intelligence organization I talked about earlier with Colonel Donovan. But Stevenson's also in charge of intelligence in the Caribbean and in South America, and he and Fleming get on like a house on fire. And Fleming, the only time Fleming kind of says in one of his introductions, he talks about who was Bond based on, and he said if there's one person, it would be this amazing Canadian, William Stevenson. Well, he apparently, my father-in-law revealed that this man wasn't Canadian, he was Icelandic, and he was a man called William Stanger, who was left by his Icelandic mother in Winnipeg when he was 4 because she couldn't afford any more. His father had died, he was a Scotsman. And so he's left with the Stefanssons, my wife's family, and he grows up as a Stefansson, and which he anglicizes to Stevenson. But he becomes a kind of pilot when the war starts in 1914, and he volunteers. He's quite small, and he gets his pilot's license, and he flies in Europe, and he's captured by the Germans, and he pinches from his prisoner of war camp a rather wonderful tin opener that the Germans have, and he brings it back to Winnipeg, and he patents this because he thinks he's going to make his fortune from a can opener. And he gets all my father-in-law's patients from the Icelandic community to sink their money into his can opener, and it goes belly up, leaving many, many bankruptcies, including him. And he leaves Winnipeg in the dead of night in 1921. And on board ship to England, he meets a Tennessee tobacco heiress who he marries, and she then funds his new life in England, where he meets Max Beaverbrook, who owns the Express. And by the time he's 30, he's developed this, he does the first ever photographs done by radio on newspapers. So he does a kind of, he invents the mechanism by which we can transmit photographs, basically, with his Tennessee tobacco wife's money. And so he's a millionaire, he becomes a friend of Churchill's, and this is Churchill then makes him his supremo in America in the Second World War. And so when my wife says that, you know, it's my father who revealed to the world who he really was, I thought that was interesting too. So I decided with all these things that I would indeed write the life of Ian Fleming. That's your answer to that.
Excellent. My close friend and main cancer buddy, Professor Vincent Gillespie, who always accompanies me on these debates, is sadly too ill to be able to join us. He sends us all best wishes. But he has a question for Nicholas, and he was wondering what Ian Fleming's method of composition was. Was he a splurger? Did he come up with compositional drafts with a plan, present framework, or did he write a certain number of words every day? And Vincent also says, how does this compare to you, Nicholas, to your own method of composition?
Well, I alluded to my grandfather's rule of 2,000 words a day. I mean, I think one of the things I came to realize with Fleming is that I think he was probably bipolar. His son, Caspar, was bipolar, and bipolar is a hereditable illness. And so many of the contradictions that I was perceiving in Fleming, I mean, he's constantly talked of as a scrum of people that you don't know. He's going to be a different person 2 hours later to the person he was 2 hours before. And this is, Chapman was a bit like that. And so many of these contradictions that are rather difficult to kind of, you know, process and make sense of become explicable if one sees him through a bipolar lens. And that also means that he can't really concentrate for more. He always said that people would say, well, can't you write slightly better books? You know, if you spent, but he only spent 2 months on every book. So these 14 books, they were like punctual as blossom. He goes out to Jamaica, he sits down, and he just writes 2,000 words a day till the Bond books are finished. And then he spends, you know, he'll do a bit of editing with it. He had a very good editor. But he didn't spend too much time kind of rewriting. I mean, I'm a novelist, and I would spend 3 or 4 years on a novel. But that, I don't think, unless you're quite lucky. I mean, occasionally a writer will get a bit of luck, even in war. You know, he writes Decline and Fall in a few months. Or Marquez writes Love in the Time of Cholera in about 6 months. But by and large, you're spending 3 or 4 years on a novel, and it's difficult to spend less. Fleming used a kind of journalistic talent. He'd worked for Reuters, and so I think he absolutely knew how to write cleanly and quickly. And so the virtues of the Bond books are that they've got pace. He wanted the pace of somebody on a pair of water skis after a boat. And he thought if you wrote too well, if you worried about the soft language, you would drag the pace down. And I think he's true in that. So they're still very readable. I don't know how many of you still read them. I mean, he's not. If the films weren't out, we probably wouldn't be reading them. But they're still pretty. They're pretty good. They're better than you think they might be if you're not a Fleming fan. I mean, he's like Somerset Maugham in that respect, who he was a friend of. He knew his rank was kind of second row, and I don't think he was worried by people kind of saying you're not Evelyn Waugh. He would like to have written probably a book that would last, and he described this as being a bit of Evelyn Waugh, a bit of Tolstoy. His favourite novel was War and Peace, I think, which he read in the German. But I would say that he's a journalist writing a novelist to journalist deadlines, and that gives it the energy and the pace. And he probably wasn't capable, because of his bipolarity, of concentrating for 3 years on anything.
What have you got lined up next on the novel front, or two?
Well, I'm just finished, literally yesterday, the novel I'd begun. I was so rudely interrupted. In Australia. It's a kind of sequel to a novel called The Sandpit, which was set in Oxford. I mean, one of the things, I feel like I shouldn't leave this room without telling you of the thing that excited me most about the discovery of all these things, which was, I mentioned that JFK, the Kennedys had in London, when Kennedy's father was ambassador, they occupied the site of where Fleming's grandfather was. And there's an amazing moment at which the Fleming books take off, because we don't really realize that he does his books every year, but they don't really take off. I mean, they sell 4,000 or 5,000 copies in hardback. And he's thinking of giving up From Russia with Love. And at the end of From Russia with Love, he has Irma Klebb, I think, with a steel tip, poison, and Fleming falls to the ground, and we don't think we're going to see him again. And indeed, Fleming tells his publisher, I don't think I'm going to do another book this year. But what happens? The Suez Canal crisis happens. Eden invades the Suez Canal without American help, and suddenly it all goes pear-shaped, and Eden's having a meltdown, and Eden's wife, who is Casper's godmother, says to the Flemings, we've heard so much about Goldeneye. Do you think we could borrow Goldeneye for 3 weeks to have a recuperation during the Suez crisis? So they haven't told Eden, the Prime Minister, that Goldeneye has no telephone or even glass in the windows. And so Fleming thinks this is great. It'll kind of really put my house on the map so I can rent it out. So in the middle of the Suez crisis, Anthony Eden goes like a kind of Bond villain to the gazebo in Goldeneye and directs operations from Fleming, where Bond was created 5 years earlier. What happens is that, you know, Eden's having a breakdown, and he goes out in the bay in Fleming's boat, which has a puncture in it, and he kind of sinks in the dinghy. But he's sinking also in his reputation, and it's almost as if James Bond is emerging from the same waters that Eden is sinking into. And James Bond becomes this one-man person who will save the British Empire, a kind of one-man Suez force. And so all the readers of the Express, which Max Beaverbrook, who also has a house in Jamaica, suddenly decides, Max Beaverbrook, he will serialize From Russia with Love. And he will then do a strip cartoon in the Express. So overnight, when From Russia with Love comes out, suddenly we're going up to 20,000 copies in hardback, and Fleming has to continue the sausage machine to do more Bonds. And what happens, he's always trying to get a film to come out, and no one's interested in America in this limey hero. And what happens? So this is the part that I really was fascinated by. So I hope you'll indulge me if I tell you. One night in 1960, JFK's announced that he's going to stand as president candidate. And it's March 1960. And Fleming is returning from Jamaica with a new Bond in his briefcase. And he stops off in Washington to see his Sunday Times correspondent, who he's in charge of, a man called Henry Brandon. And he goes to see his old friend Otzi Leiter, a woman who he's known for years. And she is a friend of JFK's, and in fact, JFK now rents her house in Georgetown. And she has introduced JFK to James Bond. So when JFK had a back problem in 1953. He said, "Oh, did you have any kind of thrillers I could read?" And she sends him the Ian Fleming Casino Royale, and then he likes it so much he gets all the other books. So Fleming's meeting Otzi on Sunday, and Otzi's driving him in her Chrysler, and suddenly they see Jack Kennedy and his wife leave Holy Trinity Church after the Sunday service, and she honks, and Kennedy comes over, and Otzi says, "Meet Ian Fleming." And Kennedy puts his head through the window and says, "Not the Ian Fleming. Would you come to dinner tonight?" And so Fleming goes to dinner with JFK. There are only about 6 people at this dinner in Otzi's old house with Otzi. And this extraordinary dinner, I think, is what changes the whole fortunes of James Bond, and not only James Bond. Because 18 months before, Castro had this revolution with the Barbudos, the bearded ones, against Batista. And it's very vexatious to the Americans. What do we do about Castro? And after dinner, Kennedy turns to Fleming and says, "What would James Bond do about Castro?" And I think it's always been interpreted that this is a kind of jokey thing. But what Kennedy's really saying is, what would Ian Fleming do about Castro? Because Kennedy was also in naval intelligence in the war. Kennedy knows that just round the corner, 3 streets away, Ian Fleming and Donovan were setting up the American Intelligence Service. And he also knows that Fleming, living in Jamaica, which is 90 miles from Cuba, has pretty good info on what's going on in Cuba. And indeed, Fleming sent this wonderful writer, Norman Lewis, a great travel writer, to Cuba under the Sunday Times kind of cover to find out what was happening in Cuba with Castro. And the intelligence report that Lewis sends back, and Lewis told me that he felt that Fleming was still working for intelligence. Fleming sends that on to SIS. Anyway, the other thing is that Kennedy also knows that Fleming's grandfather, Robert Fleming, practically financed Cuba in the First World War. He was in charge of the Cuban Sugar Company. He financed the Cuban railways. He financed the Cuban Electricity Company. So he knew that Fleming would still have amazing intel on Cuba. So he's asking, Fleming, what would James Bond do about Castro? Fleming realizes this is his moment. He's got this man who's possibly going to be president, who's a Bond fan, who's asking him his opinion. So he's on fire, and he gives the suggestions based on many of the Second World War operations that he and Donovan had worked on. And he suggests, Otzi later remembers him suggesting these 3 things that Kennedy was just entranced by. And he says, you've got to make fun of this man. So drop lots of lavatory paper with his face on it. Drop from the planes counterfeit pesos, so there'll be a run on the economy. Land a submarine and announce that Castro's dead and that the second coming has happened, because the Cubans are very religious, and have a cross projected against the night sky so that they'll all think that the second coming's happened. And most of all, drop leaflets suggesting the Americans have conducted nuclear experiments in the area, which has resulted in facial hair falling off. So all the bearded revolutionaries would lose their machismic hair. Anyway, Kennedy thought this was the kipper's knickers. And he tries to get hold of Alan Dulles the following morning, head of CIA, to say, you've got to get hold of Ian. He's got these amazing ideas of what we do with Castro. And there's a meeting that morning on the Monday that Dulles is having to actually give to have Operation Mongoose, which will be the operation to try and kill Castro and to try and part of the Bay of Pigs the following year is part of this operation. And Eisenhower greenlights that 3 days later. We don't know if he manages to get hold of Ian Fleming. But what is extraordinary is how the Bay of Pigs operation the following year seems to be a kind of Ian Fleming kind of operation. Not only is it couched in Ian Fleming terms. I mean, Bobby Kennedy, the brother, the Attorney General, looks at William Tucker, who is the task force commander, and says, you'll know Ian Fleming. And then when it all goes pear-shaped, Kennedy says this wouldn't have happened to 007. I mean, they're using Bond as a kind of, a one-man story. The CIA is imagining Bond as a kind of, blueprint for. And we don't know what other things Fleming said, because all these papers were destroyed, the Church Committee, I think. But we do know that there were these stories that you should invent a kind of... Castro was known to be a diver like Fleming, and so have this exploding goggles or exploding seashells. Fleming loved collecting seashells, and I can't believe this wasn't a Fleming idea, that Castro would go frog diving for conches and there'd be an exploding conch. All these ideas came out, and they have kind of Ian Fleming's mark on them. So that when the Bay of Pigs fiasco happens, it is a kind of bad James Bond villain type thing that goes wrong. And as I said, the Kennedys talk about this wouldn't have happened to 007. So it's not only that Fleming influences JFK. 2 years later, November '63, you've got From Russia with Love finally comes out as a film, and it's going to be shown in the White House projection room. Kennedy's already seen Dr. No in the same room, and many of the people who were in that dinner party I've just described in 1960 are invited to this showing. And Kennedy can't be there because he's in Dallas. And we know what happens then. But what we don't know is that when the FBI go into the room of Lee Harvey Oswald, what do they find but 4 James Bond books, including From Russia with Love, which has as its assassin a man called Donovan. I think Fleming's paying homage to William Donovan, who is the prize Smersh assassin. And Lee Harvey Oswald, I don't know how much you know about this, was a kind of strange man who defects. He works in Japan on top secret planes, the U-2 planes, and he defects to Russia, I think hoping possibly that he will become regarded like a kind of William Donovan figure in From Russia with Love, a kind of hero. But the Russians completely ignore him and send him off to work as a menial operator in a radio factory in Minsk. And about 2 years later, he comes back with his tail between his legs. And he reads that Kennedy has announced that one of his favorite novels in Life magazine is From Russia with Love. This really takes off for Fleming. 13 million people suddenly are now being alerted to the fact the president thinks James Bond is a wonderful book. But Lee Harvey Oswald starts reading these books, and in that summer, he calls himself as a pseudonym James. I mean, extraordinary. And so clearly, you have to see that the person who kills, it's not only Kennedy who's obsessed by Bond, it's also the person who kills Kennedy who's obsessed by Bond. But there's a third victim here, which is Fleming himself. I mean, Fleming himself is assassinated by his own creation. And I remember when I did these programs on Evelyn Waugh years ago, how the children told me that the best charade Evelyn Waugh ever did was the death scene of Ian Fleming. And I'd forgotten that until I was writing this book. And so they were still alive, and I contacted them and I said, what was the death scene of Ian Fleming in that charade? And 2 of them couldn't remember, but James could, and he said it was amazing. It was by far Daddy's best charade. And they would always, Evelyn Waugh would always do charades on the last day of the school holidays in the drawing room at Coombe Florey. And this charade, as far as James Fleming remembers, is that Waugh was whispered the word bondsman to perform. And so he gets down on the carpet and he performs silently the act of Ian Fleming having a brilliant idea that he tells his wife, Anne, I've got this brilliant idea that's going to make it millions, and then it's Bond, and then suddenly the whole sequence ends with Evelyn Waugh strangling himself with a kind of horrific gurgle on the carpet because he's created a Frankenstein monster which has killed him. And so that is quite a good image for how Bond really destroys Fleming's career, because he becomes the most famous writer in the world in 1963. So, I mean, he's selling 25 million copies, and these two films have come out, Dr. No and From Russia with Love. There are queues around Leicester Square, and it's not kind of what he wants. I mean, and I think his final months are really sad. I think he's been swallowed by his own creation. And what he really wanted, I talked to Algy Clough about this, who was a young soldier, a member of Boodle's club, who sat next to him when he was 22 in 1963. Fleming's only a year away from his death, and he said to Fleming, "You must love all this publicity." And Fleming said, "No, I can't stand it. It's not what I want." And Algy Clough said, "Well, what do you want?" And he said, "I'd like to be the captain of the Royal St. George's Golf Club. That's what I really want." And he meant it. And one of the sadnesses is that on the Saturday before he dies, he is elected captain designate of the Royal St. George's Golf Club. And he goes out for one day, plays a round of golf, and then he collapses and he dies the following night. So he never even achieves that. Thing.
Nicholas, I've got sort of three things which I'll jam together, and you just bite into the one that you most like. I remember you saying it takes 2 years to extricate yourself from the persona of the biography, and you sometimes retreat to Tasmania to do so, as you did with Bruce Chatwin. Do you have another possible biography do you want to write, or do you never want to go there again? Given your previous novels set in troubled times in Peru, The Dancer Upstairs, Snowleg set in the height of the Second World War, the current very troubled political situation and threat of nuclear war, do you think that might produce a novel or possibly a biography? And lastly, we spoke after the film, and it's a good ripping yarn of a film. We spoke, you and I, and the film The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, based on this book. And you expressed disappointment about the way that Ian Fleming was used to sell a dubious story. Would you warn us against any other faux Fleming stuff? But particularly interested in whether the threat of a nuclear war might push you into a bunker to write something.
Well, there'll be no readers. Well, actually, Snowleg is about somebody discovering nuclear fusion at the Dragon School. I think it's very odd where ideas for novels come from. Because, I mean, as I said, you're going to be stuck with the novel for 3 or 4 years, so you're almost trying not to find ideas. So I always liken a novel to a cliche, but a pebble in the shoe, something you've got to get rid of. And in my case, I write the novel to answer a question, to try and find out by the act of writing it the situation that I had thought of. I don't want to do another biography. I think biography is you are in a kind of somebody else's head, and you have to be completely non-judgmental. However much I didn't really like Fleming, by the end I did quite like him. I was sympathetic towards him, but you have to suspend. You have to see them in all their facets and not be moralistic or not judge them. And that's quite an effort, because I'm not normally a very judgmental person. So I have to suspend all that when I'm doing a biography. I don't think I want to do another one, but I think fiction's the only game in town. I mean, all novels are exercises in failure, but I think a great novel is an amazing victory against the darkness. And there aren't many, but one can just try and attempt some of the lower foothills. Have you got questions? I feel I've talked too much.
Yeah, I've enjoyed your biography very, very much, and at the same time I was reading the biography of Noel Coward, and I was struck by the similarities, in a sense, unlikely similarities between the two characters, both the war effort in the States and also Jamaica. You'd like to sort of elaborate on that?
Well, I think Coward loved Fleming, although he knew that he would never sexually get there with him. And he thought, he has a wonderful word for it, he thought it would do him a power of good if he did have a schmozzle, or whatever he called it. So Coward is involved with Peter Fleming, really, initially, because Coward does brief encounter with Celia Johnson, and who is married to Peter Fleming. And I think it's part of Ian Fleming conquering his elder brother. After the war, he suddenly tips. It becomes Ian rather than Peter who is mixing with Noel Coward. And Coward is, as you say, he's working for William Stevenson in the war as one of the kind of peripatetic intelligence officers. And he goes to Jamaica and falls in love with Jamaica and wants to live there after the war. And he rents Ian Fleming's house, and Ian Fleming charges him an astronomical sum, and then buys a plot of land, you know, the nearest plot of land, really. And so Coward and Fleming live side by side in Jamaica, but also in England, because Coward has a house in Dover, near Dover, St. Margaret's Bay, and he lets Ian Fleming take over one of the cottages, which Eric Newby had been renting. And when Coward himself leaves the main house, Fleming takes it over. And so that they are very, very, I think they both love each other without there being any sexual element there. And Coward is buried up near Goldeneye. I mean, that's where his final resting place is. And Coward writes a novel. The only novel he writes, Pomp and Circumstance, is all based on Ian Fleming. And he writes a short story about him. So I think Coward is very much obsessed by Ian Fleming. And Fleming loved him very much, but I think was quite used to people being obsessed by him. And Fleming never wrote plays or anything like that. But I think they got on and laughed a lot.
Are there any other books that ride on the back of Ian Fleming?
Well, I think
like
one of the problems of Ian, why this book is so long, and I apologise for its length, but I mean, the thing about Fleming is that you could do a book on Fleming and golf, you could do a book on Fleming and women, you could do a book on Fleming's cars, you can do a book on Fleming and intelligence. You could, every aspect of him, it becomes a kind of obsession with the constituency. Fleming's martinis. And I think that's part of his legend. So that many books like this, I mean, Fleming wasn't involved in this operation at all. But what do we have? Ian Fleming's Postmaster. And I think there are 20 of these books that bear no relation to the, but it's not my job to go and say this, but I didn't mention this at all, even in the biography, but it was quite interesting once you put the wire wool over all these stories, how much comes away. He did have the idea for Operation Mincemeat, but he wasn't involved with it, he just gave them the idea. And I think that's part of his attraction, that he's got fingers in so many pies. I mean, practically around Admiralty Arch, endless hotels and restaurants where, this is where you can have a Ian Fleming martini. This hotel in London that's just opened on the site of Fleming's office is not nowhere near anything Fleming had to do with. But anyway, I'm farting against thunder to say that. The legend is there. And a bit like the legend of Fleming as the wife-beating Old Etonian bounder. I don't think I'm going to be able to shift it, really. What did you think after finishing the biography? Did you still think he was probably what you thought he was?
Well, I was very interested, I had a view about him clearly.
Yeah.
The bounder idea and the womanizer and all
Yeah.
that. But what thing struck me psychologically was the fact that I hadn't realised how much he was his brother had been so much more successful.
Yeah.
To start with, and I wondered whether that had some sort of psychological thing in his character.
I think that...
His brother, Peter, was extraordinarily successful.
Yeah.
In his teens and 20s.
Well, like Alec Waugh, I mean, they're very famous. I think that is a motivating, very much motivating to overturn his brother, his famous brother. And it apparently is a very, very strong Adler, Fleming had studied under in Austria, who was himself a student of Freud. I think the second son syndrome is a very big defining motivation in many writers.
Nicholas, we're going to, in order for these people to get copies of your book, which are upstairs signed for their parents or themselves for Christmas or New Year or whenever, birthdays, draw the line there. But will you promise to come back when your next novel comes out and update us on all things Oxford, Sandpit, and subsequent the next one?
If you have me.
Of course.
Yes.